Hello, I'm Virgil Dominic. What a privilege and pleasure it is to take part in a WKY TV memory show. Thanks so much for inviting me. Well, my story began like this. It was back in 1959, and I was completing my tour of duty as an officer in the U.S. Air Force. I was stationed at Holloman Air Force Base in Alamogordo, New Mexico. That's located out in the desert, and it was a perfect place for testing the latest in missiles, aircraft, and space technology. I had worked at WKY right after I graduated from the University of Tulsa, but I was there only about 6 weeks before I got called to duty in the Air Force. But I had kept in touch with Bob Gamble and Jim Terrell, both former news directors. And about 3 years into my tour of duty, I was getting ready to get out of the Air Force, and I got a phone call from a guy named Dick John. And he explained that he was the news director and that he wanted to be me. So Dick, whom I later learned loved to pilot airplanes, well, he flew out to the New Mexico desert, and he landed, picked me up, and we then flew on to El Paso, which was the nearest big city, and we caught a cab to the NBC station there. And once in that newsroom, Dick gathered up some AP copy, told me to write a script, which I did, and then he put me on camera to audition me as a news anchor. Well, of course, there were no teleprompters back then, and Dick asked me to look into the camera as much as I could while he watched from the control room. So I guess I did pretty well because Dick offered me a job right on the spot, and 4 weeks later I was out of the Air Force and started my first television reporting job at WKY, and never will forget it. I was making all of $200 a week, and glad to have it. Dick was to become a lifelong friend, and he in many ways was the most amazing anchorman I ever saw. You know, while the rest of us wrote out our scripts, Dick just wrote notes. He basically ad-libbed every newscast he ever did, and brother, he was really, really good at it. Well, of course, I needed a lot of training, and I had so many mentors there, great guys who were so generous in sharing their knowledge and experience. One story I recalled shortly after my arrival, Dick called me into his office, and he said to me, he introduced me to a guy named Cliff Atkins. And Cliff was a great photographer, and to this very day, he also remains a very dear friend. So Dick says, Cliff, take Virgil out to a park and show him how to use the camera equipment. So Cliff and I load what seems to me to be tons of gear into a station wagon, and we drive out to a park, and Cliff opens the tailgate and says, "Virg, get out the tripod." I look at Cliff and I say, what's a tripod? I was as green as a new leaf on a summer tree. Well, these were the early days of the one-man band, and everyone had to learn how to do everything. Load the film into the cameras, use a light meter, shoot the picture, record the sound, gather information, ask the questions, bring the film back and develop it. Write the script, edit the film, do the narration, and at last put it on the air. Everyone had a special interest, like Cliff and another great guy, Houston Hall. They wanted to be photographers, and both of them became terrific photographers. I and others wanted to be reporters and anchors. Well, it made no difference back then. We all had to do everything. Ernie Schultz. Ernie was a reporter back then, and Ernie was one of the smartest guys I ever met. I can't imagine the patience he showed me when he took me down to the courtroom and told me the difference between an arraignment and a preliminary hearing. Good old Ernie. One of the stories we covered regularly was the news conferences of the governor. Well, it was a long way from the Capitol parking lot to the governor's office, especially when you were carrying, I don't know, 65 pounds of gear. You know, there was the silent camera, the sound camera, the batteries, the lights, the wires, the microphones, all encased into two silver metal containers with straps that you used to hoist them onto your shoulders and carry them on up to the office. The governor back then sat at the end of a long table surrounded by expert newspaper and wire service reporters. They were based at the Capitol, and all they did was cover the governor and the legislature. It was their beat, and they knew more about state government than many of the elected officials. Well, you know what? All of this was a bit intimidating. After we set up our gear at the other end of the room, the television reporters just kind of stood up and surrounded the table and listened to the newspaper reporters. Well, all of us were welcome to ask questions, but we seldom did because it was complicated stuff. So one day Houston Hall and I were talking back at the station, and he wanted to know how it was going. So I told him I was really having trouble figuring out what to ask the governor. And Houston's reply was one of the great television lessons I've ever learned. He said, "Yeah, I know I had the same problem at first. And then I decided to do something. I decided, you know what? I'm not going to worry about those newspaper reporters and what they ask. I'm just going to ask the question I personally am interested in." I figure it's probably what the audience wants to know too. Well, it's very, very good advice. After the newspaper guys finished, they left, and we led the governor to the other side of the room. He stood at a podium facing the cameras. I'd take the light meter reading, set the f-stop on the big sound Oregon camera. It was connected to the battery, and when I flipped the switch, the film started running inside the camera. I framed the governor in the center of the shot, and I called out to him. I said, "Now, Governor, stand still. If you move, you're gonna move out of frame." So then I grabbed the microphone, stepped up to the podium, and began asking the governor questions. Those were the days, my friends, and that's how it was done. All of us did it that way. Well, then I repacked all the gear in those big metal cases. I got in the car and raced back to the station. And now came one of the scariest moments of my whole career. You know, back then you had to develop the film in this gigantic Houston Fearless machine. You had to unload the film in the dark, load it again into a gigantic canister, and then fit it into one end of the machine, all in the dark. Quite a challenge for a guy who has trouble changing a light bulb in the daylight. Finally, you turned on the light and flipped the switch that started this gigantic machine. It was scary as heck. That machine shook and rattled and grumbled with the sound of a dragon as it came to life. The film moved through various tanks of chemicals that they were on pulleys, up and down, they moved the film. Once I assured myself that everything was working, I raced back to the newsroom and began typing the script. There was a great discipline here. You had to write the script in exactly 22 minutes. That was when the developed film came out of the machine, and you had to be there to gather the film, or it would just run out on the floor, get dirty, and be ruined. To this day, I believe there is no story on earth that cannot be written in 22 minutes. Then it was on to the editing room. You put the film on a reel and ran it through a viewer, and then rolled it up on another reel at the other end. You picked your shots. You physically tore the film with your fingers, measured it on a yardstick that measured seconds instead of inches, and then you hung the strips of film up on a board that contained clothespins. That's right, clothespins. Well, by the time you finished editing, you'd have 20, 30, 40 strips of film in order on the clothespins. And then you had to glue them all together and take the finished film to the projection room. It was really, really intense. You know, there were obviously a lot of fun times in the newsroom, but of course there were a lot of dramatic times. And one time, Dick John, boy, he really got mad at me. I'll never forget this. It was a 4th of July weekend, and Dick was anchoring, and I was the single reporter. About noontime, there came a call over the police radio. There was a possible drowning at a swimming pool at a home not far away from the station. So I jump in my trusty red, white, and black WKY news car, and I go roaring down the road. I pull into the dirt driveway of this home, and holy mackerel, I am there even before the rescue squads had arrived. So I grab my camera and I start running toward the pool. By that time I could see several adults weeping and screaming. And then I see that they are gathered around the body of a small boy who was lying at the edge of that pool. Then they see me with my camera at the ready. Their screams intensified tenfold. The mother's flailing her hands at me. The father is cursing me. I could not bring myself to shoot such an horrific scene. So I go back to the car and I call on the two-way radio back to Dick, and I tell him that. But boy, Dick is adamant. Are you a reporter or not? He says. Go back there and get those shots. That's my lead story for the 6 o'clock show. Well, I sneak. That's the word. I was trying to hide myself. I sneak back to the pool. I try to hide behind some bushes to get the pictures. By this time, the rescue squads have arrived, and boy, they are laboring feverishly over the body of this poor little boy. So, of course, the family sees me again. They go absolutely berserk. They start throwing Coke bottles at me. I run back to the car, and this time, I don't even call Dick. I just drive back to the station. I go in the newsroom, I throw my camera down on the counter. Dick says, "What kind of shots did you get?" I tell him, I didn't get any. I couldn't shoot it, Dick. It was just too terrible. Dick, my news director, is really, really unhappy with me. You know, I went home that night. I got a beer, I sat in my backyard, looked up at the stars, and I asked myself if I really belonged in this business. I was so affected by this tragedy that I had seen. It was a long night. Well, obviously I stayed in the business, but my philosophy had changed. I felt and still feel that some stories are so private, so filled with grief, that we should not take pictures of such scenes. I further believe the public has no right to see those kinds of shocked scenes of such intimate sadness. I know, a lot of journalists disagree with me, and that's okay, but I had to do it my way, and I have. One night, Cliff and I are working the 10 o'clock news. He's editing and I'm anchoring, and we're very excited. It's a special night for one of our own, a reporter named Alan Bickle, is leaving to take a job in Indianapolis, and we're giving a party for him. All of our friends are gathered at Cliff's house, where his wife Barbara has prepared a great feast. Cliff and I can hardly wait to get there. So we finish the show, we clean up the newsroom, and we're out the door racing to Cliff's house. Well, the party is well underway. You know, they started at 7, now it's almost 11. So our friends greet us with shouts of joy. Obviously, a lot of drinking has been underway, and Cliff and I hasten to catch up. An hour later, the telephone rings. It's the night security guard back at the station. He reports that a giant oil refinery on the outskirts of Oklahoma City has blown up. My God, what do we do? The biggest news story of the year, and the entire WKY news staff is drunk. Everyone begins yelling at once. In an insane act of manliness, we all throw our liquor glasses into the fireplace, leaving poor Barbara to clean up the mess. We charge into the cold night, stop briefly at the station to gather every last piece of our gear, and then in a string of cars we roar out to the scene. It's like hell. Gigantic orange flames are shooting into the air. Columns of gray and black smoke. They're smothering the entire area. I never will understand this, but for some reason Dick gets the idea that each reporter should stand in front of the camera and describe the scene, all ad lib. Well, I'm the rookie, so I have to go last. I am standing there listening to Dick and Ernie and Cliff and Houston and all the others saying such incredible words of description. And then it's my turn. Well, what else is there to say? You know, I begin and I'm watching the flames and I'm talking. It's the longest 3 minutes of my life. Now, you're not going to believe this. I'm honored now to be a member of 5 broadcast halls of fame, but you would never believe that possible on this night. For on that night, running out of words, I hear myself say, "It's a great fire, folks. I wish you were here." Unbelievable. Well, we cover the story all through the night. We cover the story. We feed the Today Show. We cover the story all through the daytime. We feed the Huntley Brinkley Show on NBC. And of course, that WKY news team covers the story brilliantly. Tremendous photography, great writing, dramatic narration, although not by me. Later in the year, we win every news award there is, despite starting out, all of us, 3 sheets to the wind. The 1964 World's Fair. By then, Dick has left to become news director in Pittsburgh, and Ernie is our news director. Oklahoma is putting together an imaginative display for the World's Fair. It's big. It's in the shape of the state. And inside the boundaries, there are miniature towns and cities and set up showing off our agriculture, our oil, the great OU football team, our people, all the things that make Oklahoma a great place to live. Well, Cliff and I are absolutely dying to go. But Ernie says there's no money in the budget. Cliff and I get off by ourselves and we talk and we call the Air National Guard, Oklahoma's Air National Guard. To cut costs, we arranged to fly to New York City for free aboard a National Guard plane. So we go back to Ernie, we tell him that, same story, no money. Cliff and I get off again, and we decide to put some real pressure on. Ernie, I don't think even knows this, but Cliff and I called the governor, and we asked him to call Ernie. Well, finally, Ernie relents, at least a little. He comes up with $300 for everything, including a hotel room in New York City for 3 nights. Cliff is not happy. Come on, buddy, I tell him, it's going to be a lot of fun. So before we left, Ernie charged us with producing an hour show, an hour special. We get to New York, we find a hotel room, we get our credentials, and we are off to the World's Fair. My gosh, there's so much to shoot. Cliff and I are there day and night, and we're surviving on a diet of pizza and Carlsberg beer every day. Late in the afternoon of the second day, we are flopped down on the grass, taking a break. Who should come strolling by but Norm Bagwell, our general manager. He's glad to see us, wonders how we're doing, asks us if we need any money, Cliff opens his mouth to shout yes, but I stop him. Nope, Mr. Bagwell, we're doing just fine. Well, what could I do? Ernie says to do it on $300, and I don't want to disappoint Ernie. I think Cliff is still mad at me to this very day. The highlight of the World's Fair is the Vatican exhibit. Its highlight is the Pietà, Michelangelo's masterpiece of the Blessed Mother holding the fallen Jesus in her lap. Cliff and I decided we just have to have it. But the lines are enormous at the Vatican exhibit, stretching for blocks. How in the world are we going to get in? We're milling around close to the entrance to the Vatican, trying to figure it out, and I see a priest at the door, and he's greeting visitors. So I kind of muscle my way through the crowd, apologizing as I go, and finally I'm in front of the priest. I explain we are from WKY in Oklahoma City, and we're doing a special show. We want to feature the Pietà. He shakes his head no. Father, I say, please, I'm Catholic. Oklahoma is mostly non-Catholic. If you let us in, we might be able to convert some people. Well, he looks at me, his face lights up, and he tells us to come back at 10 o'clock that night when the Vatican exhibit closes for the day. He'll meet us there, and he'll let us in. Well, Cliff and I are there at 10 o'clock. Lo and behold, the massive crowds are gone. The Father lets us in. Cliff and I look at each other in disbelief. We are all alone in the most important exhibit at the World's Fair. We are inches from the Pietà, and we have her all to ourselves. We are in the presence of genius and greatness. It's a moment that will stay with us forever, I'm sure. You know, I also learned something during the course of that story. I learned that sometimes being a good journalist also means being a good salesman. John F. Kennedy, November 22nd, 1963. It is the noon hour and I'm getting ready to go to work. My wife has the television on. Suddenly the sound goes silent. A bulletin slide comes on the screen, then a serious voice informs the world that President Kennedy has been shot in Dallas, Texas, about 100 miles away from Oklahoma City. Unbelievable. Well, I rush to the station and enter the newsroom. Usually bustling with activity, I find it eerie quiet. I see my fellow newsmen staring at the television monitor. Not a word is said. Then comes the announcement. The president is dead. The quiet is shattered now with shouts from all of the reporters. Oh my God, I can't believe it. No, no, no. Faces are full of tears, and this goes on a while. Finally, Ernie calls us together, and we begin to work on our coverage. NBC has already announced it is canceling all programming, including commercials, to cover this momentous story. The network will not be relinquishing any of its time to local stations until 10 p.m. Central Standard Time. The 10 p.m. news is the show I anchor. There is much discussion, much disagreement about what we should do or should not do. Ernie listens and finally decides that the best coverage we at WKY can provide, and coverage that will be different from what the network has been doing, is a look back at the times President Kennedy visited our state. During his presidency, Mr. Kennedy had visited Oklahoma, I think about 4 times. And of course, Our station had covered those visits extensively. We had a lot of film in our archives. We only had a few hours to retrieve that film, review it, and edit it into a meaningful news report. Everybody goes to work pulling all of that film out of the archives. Ernie turns to me at the height of this and said, "Virg, you know, this is your show. I'm assigning Cliff to edit it for you. You guys work together. You write it and anchor it, and I know you can do it. You know, and good luck." So I begin to think, how in the world am I going to do this? The task is made more difficult because I am struggling with my own feelings of sadness over what has happened. I can't help thinking back to President Kennedy's inauguration day in January of 1961. I am 27 years old, fresh out of the Air Force. I'd already shot a couple of stories that morning, and when I returned to the station, I went into the control room to watch the ceremonies coming from Washington. And there stood the young president, challenging America's citizens with those famous words, famous now. "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what can you do for your country?" It was a speech of inspiration, and I felt it deeply, especially because I had just left behind 3 years in the U.S. Air Force, where patriotism and duty surround you every day. One of President Kennedy's visits was to rural Oklahoma. He had come to dedicate a dam. The speaker's podium was surrounded by wide farm fields. This day they were filled with thousands of people, even though it was far out in the country. I had a big sound camera set up on a tripod about 30 feet from the president, who was standing on a raised wooden platform. As he spoke, I moved the camera lens in for an extreme close-up. I can still see the president's face as it filled the screen. A strong, strong face, lit with fervor and intensity. It seems only yesterday. When the speech ended, I hoisted the big sound camera onto my shoulder and I moved toward the platform. There was little security back in those days. The crowd jostled me, they pushed me forward, and suddenly, I was almost face to face with President Kennedy. Our eyes met. He smiled and said to me, "That thing looks heavy." "Yes, sir," I replied, before he was whisked away by the cheering crowd. Now, back to the newsroom. It's 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 5 hours to showtime. Everyone had gone home by that time except for me and Cliff. I am writing the show on a typewriter, of course, no computers back then. As soon as I finish one page of the script, Cliff takes it to the editing room where he is assembling the film for the show. It takes a long time, and although it goes unspoken, both Cliff and I know we want to do our very best. We want our work to honor the fallen president. A little after 9 o'clock, I begin practicing the script out loud. At 9:30 or so, I feel my voice beginning to tighten up. Neither Cliff nor I had had anything to eat since noon. The emotion and stressful preparation were taking their toll. Oh no, I think. Oh no. I can't lose my voice at the very moment when I need it the most. We had a kitchen at the station. It was there that I found a lemon. I began sucking the juice with the hope that that would help my voice and soothe it. A few minutes before 10, I go to the set. The studio is completely dark except for the brightly lit podium where I'm going to stand and anchor the show. There's a lot of reading to do. I'm going to be on camera several times. There's no teleprompter. I have memorized portions of the script. I want so badly to do my best. I want to honor this man. The floor director counts me down. The red camera light comes on. I begin. I have the lemon beside me. And every time we come to a soundbite where I don't have to speak, I suck on that lemon. The special report is 40 minutes long. And about 30 minutes in, I am struggling to keep my voice under control. Cliff brings me another lemon. I am nearing the end now. I'd written a very emotional close, and as I read the words, my voice begins to fade. I slow the pace. I pause. My voice grows softer. Another pause. And by the time I read the closing words, my words are a whisper. Finally, the show is over. I say, good night. I step off the set. My buddy Cliff is there. He hugs me, holds me for a moment, whispers in my ear, "You did a good job." But I don't think so. I feel I had let the audience down. I feel I had let the president down. I feel I have failed. I return to the newsroom. You know what? The telephones are ringing off the wall. The switchboard is flooded. Viewers are calling in by the hundreds, all of them wanting to congratulate me and to tell me how much my reading meant to them. They didn't know I was losing my voice. They thought I was simply overwhelmed with emotion, the same emotion that they themselves were feeling, and I had done something they could not do. I had made it public. Somehow my reading had bound me and the viewers together on this awful night. I remained in Oklahoma City for another 2 years before I had the opportunity to join NBC at WKYC TV in Cleveland, Ohio. During those 2 years, no matter where I went to cover stories in Oklahoma, people came up to me to talk about that night and my reading of that story. In a way I still do not understand. It somehow helped all of us to end that terrible, terrible day with the feeling and the faith that we would get through this tragedy, that the night would end, that morning would come, and all of us would be okay. Because we still had each other. One of the factors that made WKY so successful, I believe, was our owner, the legendary E.K. Gaylord. He came to Oklahoma even before it was a state. Imagine that. It was still Indian territory when Mr. Gaylord arrived in Oklahoma City to start a newspaper. One of the things I remember so well was the annual Christmas party. Mr. Gaylord hosted a big brunch at one of the big country clubs. Everyone was invited, the employees, their wives, their husbands, their children. We all dressed up for the occasion, and Mr. Gaylord would go around the room smiling and shaking hands. After everyone had dined, Mr. Gaylord took to the podium. Every year he gave a summary of how well the station had done, and then he thanked us for all of our hard work. He complimented us, saying his success would not have been possible were it not for us. It was good to hear, and it made us want to work even harder for this man. Well, then came the best part. He would call each of us to the podium, shake our hand, and then hand us our Christmas bonus check. When I was getting ready to leave Channel 4 to move to NBC News in Cleveland, something really, really special happened to me. Our general manager, Norm Bagwell, came down to the newsroom and said that Mr. Gaylord wanted to see me. Really, I said. I never expected such a thing. I said, Mr. Bagwell, what's going on? He said, I don't know. Well, Mr. Gaylord's office was downtown at the Daily Oklahoma newspaper at 4th and Broadway, I believe the address was. When I arrived, his secretary rose from her chair and gave me a big hug. And then she showed me into his office. By this time, Mr. Gaylord must have been in his 90s. He was seated behind a big desk, and on the desk was a can of Planters peanuts. Every once in a while, he would grab a bunch of peanuts and stuff them into his mouth. Mr. Gaylord told me that he attended a lot of meetings around the country. He said over a period of time, a lot of people would come up to him and talk to him about me. About me. Well, to say the least, I was completely stunned. By this time, I was getting on the network quite a bit. Back in those days, NBC did not have the bureaus that it has now. It depended on local affiliates that had outstanding news departments to cover news stories for the network in our respective areas. WKY, of course, was one of those stations. Mr. Gaylord said the people of those meetings had noticed my reporting, wanted to know more about me. He said that had never happened before, and he said he wanted to thank me because, he said, I made his company look so good to his peers. He took some more peanuts. He looked at me and said, you know, I don't want you to go, but I understand. I understand that you are a young man, just as I was once, and you have to go to see how far your talents will take you. I understand, because I had to do the same thing. He stood up then, he came around the desk, and he took my hand, and he said to me, don't forget that I understand, and I wish you all the luck in the world. But if things don't work out, I want you to come right back here. I'll always have a place for you in my company. You know, I've had a lot of compliments in my life, but that one means a lot because it came from a legend and it came from a true gentleman. Thank you, Mr. Gaylord. And thanks to all the good people of WKY that helped me so much. Their advice, their counsel, their caring, their criticism, which was always meant to help and not to hurt. I owe them everything. Well, I'm done. What an honor to be asked to share my memories. I thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. Now, one more time, let me say it. This is Virgil Dominic, WKY Channel 4 News in Oklahoma City. Good night.